What kind of priest could commit such a brutal act inside a house of worship? Preside at the funeral mass of the death he had caused, just 4 days after. And why did it take 24 years, nearly a quarter of a century, to bring the killer to justice? April 5, 1980. The heart of Toledo, Ohio. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the Mercy Hospital Chapel, the scent of burning candles mixes with something far more sinister. A nun, Sister Margaret and Pahl, 71, lies motionless at the foot of the altar. Her hands are folded across her chest as if in prayer, her habit eerily undisturbed. But beneath this unsettling serenity hides a crime scene straight out of a horror film. Blood stains the white altar cloth. A deep gash across her neck, strangulation marks. And then, the stab wounds. Not one. Not two. 31 times. Each precise, each calculated, some wounds form a perfect pattern across her chest, almost ritualistic. The sacred cloth beneath her is soaked in blood. It looks deliberate. Chillingly precise. A mockery of something holy. This was no random act of violence. This was something darker. The chapel should have been a place of peace. A sanctuary. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most shocking and perplexing murder mysteries in history. But who could have done this? And why, after more than 2 decades, would the truth finally surface? Father Robinson was questioned about the crime, but was not charged. The chief of the criminal division in the Lucas County Prosecutor's Office, Dean Mandros, stated that when detectives were questioning the priest 2 weeks after the killing, Deputy Police Chief Ray Vetter, who would later testify that he was a practicing Catholic, broke off the interview, against all normal procedures, and allowed a Monsignor to escort Father Robinson out of police headquarters, which upset the detectives to no end. Mandros also said Vetter asked detectives to give him their reports on the case, and some of those reports were never seen again. A cover-up was alleged. Whether Father Robinson was part of a coven, and whether other priests had participated in the murder, may have been part of what was covered up. But thanks to a letter from a woman who claimed that Robinson had sexually abused her when she was a child in a series of satanic ritual abuse, that also involved human sacrifice. The woman, using the name Survivor Doe, also filed a civil lawsuit against Father Robinson seeking financial damages for having been a victim of ritual abuse by Father Robinson and other adults dressed as nuns. Make no mistake, this case is as complex as it is disturbing. A crime buried in secrecy, shrouded in fear, and tangled in the very institution that was meant to uphold faith and justice. And tonight, you're about to uncover the terrifying truth. But before we dive in, a quick challenge for you. Only 0.1% of viewers remember to subscribe before the mystery unfolds. Be part of our first 1,000 subscribers. Click the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, like this video, and join Crime and Tragedy Watch. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The crime was monstrous, but what if I told you that the true horror was the man who walked among them all along? Sister Margaret and Pahl was no ordinary woman. For over 50 years, she dedicated her life to healing, to serving the sick, to bringing peace to the suffering. She had been a nurse, a caregiver, and a source of comfort for countless patients at Mercy Hospital. But on the morning of April 5, 1980, just 1 day before her 72nd birthday, peace was the last thing she found. She was a woman of unwavering faith, known for her discipline and deep devotion. Every morning, she meticulously prepared the chapel for daily prayers. Holy Saturday was no different. As the city of Toledo moved through its quiet morning, Margaret and Pahl followed a routine she had kept for decades, one final time. At approximately 7 a.m., she unlocked the doors to the chapel. The air was thick with incense, the flickering glow of votive candles casting long shadows across the walls. She arranged the altar, ensuring everything was in its rightful place. But as she moved through the sacred space, did she sense something was off? Did she hear the faint echo of approaching footsteps? Did she turn, realizing, too late, that someone was already inside? Hours passed. The chapel remained eerily silent. A fellow nun, Sister Maureen, arrived just before 8 a.m., expecting to see Sister Margaret and finishing up her preparations. But instead of a serene scene of devotion, she walked into horror. The altar cloth was stained dark. The room was still, too still. And there, at the foot of the altar, lay the lifeless body of Sister Margaret and Pahl. She gasped, stepping back in disbelief. The older nun's habit had been pulled neatly over her body, as if prepared for burial. But beneath the cloth, the truth was unspeakable. A cord, tied around her neck. 31 stab wounds, precise and deliberate, arranged in a pattern that sent a chill through the soul. This was no simple act of violence. This was something calculated, something deeply personal. The police arrived within minutes. But what they saw changed everything. Among the clergy, one man stood out, Father Gerald Robinson. The quiet, reserved chaplain who worked closely with Sister Margaret. But when police questioned him, something felt off. Father Robinson had been a well-respected figure at Mercy Hospital. He had been by Sister Margaret's side for years, conducting services, offering last rites to the dying, and comforting grieving families. A man of faith, duty, and discipline. But on the morning of April 5, 1980, the weight of suspicion began to shift toward him. When detectives arrived at the crime scene, Robinson was among the first to be interviewed. At first, his demeanor was calm. Too calm. When asked about his whereabouts, he hesitated. His answers were vague, his recollections cloudy. And then, there was his reaction to the crime itself, or rather, the lack of one. A woman he had worked with for years had just been murdered in cold blood, inside a place of worship. Yet, there was no visible grief. No outrage. No urgency. Just a quiet, indifferent acceptance. Investigators pressed him on his knowledge of Sister Margaret's routine. He confirmed that she had been preparing the chapel for Holy Saturday. But when asked if he had seen or heard anything unusual that morning, he simply shook his head. No. Nothing at all. But that wasn't entirely true. A nurse at the hospital recalled seeing Father Robinson acting strangely that morning. He seemed anxious. Restless. As if he was trying to keep himself busy, or distract himself. And then there was the timeline. He claimed he had been in his quarters when the murder happened, but another hospital worker had seen him near the chapel shortly before the body was discovered. The detectives took note. They had a priest who had access to the crime scene, who gave inconsistent statements, and whose behavior didn't quite match the gravity of the situation. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to make them suspicious. Then came a troubling revelation. During the autopsy, the coroner noticed something strange about the stab wounds. They were arranged in a pattern. Not random. Not frenzied. Deliberate. A deliberate cross-like formation over Sister Margaret's chest. The positioning of her body. The cloth draped over her. It all hinted at something more ritualistic. Something chillingly symbolic. And then, there was the weapon. For weeks, investigators searched for the murder weapon. A unique blade, small yet sharp enough to puncture flesh with precision. Then, one officer remembered something. A letter opener. A distinctive, ornate letter opener shaped like a dagger. It was the kind used by clergy. The kind that could be found in the office of a priest. And one priest in particular had one just like it. Father Gerald Robinson. The detectives pressed further, but before they could act, the investigation came to a screeching halt. The diocese intervened. The church, powerful and influential, urged police to move on. Without a weapon, without a confession, they had no case. And so, for 24 years, Sister Margaret and Pahl's murder remained an unsolved mystery. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Not in a town like Toledo. Not when the past has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. And 2 decades later, a shocking confession would change everything. The murder of Sister Margaret and Pahl faded from headlines, but it never faded from memory. Not for those who knew her. Not for the investigators who spent sleepless nights chasing shadows. Not for the person who had gotten away with it. April 5, 1980. The crime scene had been combed over. Statements had been taken. But the case refused to crack. Leads dried up. Evidence sat locked away, untouched. The Toledo police, frustrated and without answers, were forced to move on. And so, for over 2 decades, silence settled over the case like dust in a forgotten room. Years passed. The world changed. New crimes stole the spotlight. The murder of a nun in a chapel became an echo of the past, buried in time, swallowed by history. But even history has a way of resurfacing. By 2003, the case was nothing more than a cold file, buried deep in storage. Until someone opened it. A fresh set of eyes. A detective with a nagging feeling. Why had it gone unsolved for so long? What had they missed? Then, the break came. Not from new technology. Not from a sudden confession. But from something else entirely. A revelation that would rip open old wounds and expose something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The murder of Sister Margaret and Pahl was not an isolated act of violence. It was part of something bigger. Something buried deep beneath the surface of the church. And this time, the police weren't just dealing with a murder, they were about to uncover something even darker. 24 years had passed. 24 years of silence. The brutal murder of Sister Margaret and Pahl remained a ghost in the cold case files, buried beneath decades of unsolved crimes. But then, in 2003, everything changed. A woman came forward. She was shaking, her voice unsteady, her face pale as she sat across from investigators. What she revealed wasn't just disturbing, it cracked open a door that many in Toledo had hoped would stay closed forever. She spoke of Father Gerald Robinson. Not as a holy man. Not as a servant of God. But as something else entirely. She wasn't alone. More victims surfaced. Their stories were eerily similar, accounts of abuse, trauma, and rituals performed behind closed doors. But one detail stood out, something investigators couldn't ignore. They spoke of symbols, strange markings, ceremonies that didn't belong in any church. And when police cross-referenced these descriptions with Sister Margaret N's murder, something horrifying came to light. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was ritualistic. Detectives knew they needed more. Suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. And then, they got their first real break. Locked away in an evidence storage unit, untouched for decades, was an item that had once been dismissed as unimportant. A letter opener. It wasn't just any letter opener, it was shaped like a sword, with a design eerily similar to the wounds found on Sister Margaret N's body. Forensics had come a long way since 1980. Under new analysis, something chilling was revealed. The weapon's shape matched the stab wounds exactly. It had been in front of them the entire time. And there was more. Investigators revisited old witness statements. Father Robinson's alibi. Shaky at best. His behavior. Oddly indifferent. His access to the chapel. Unlimited. Then came the final blow. DNA testing had advanced since the 1980s. The police resubmitted evidence from the crime scene. When the results came back, they confirmed what some had suspected all along. Father Robinson wasn't just near the scene that day. He had left something behind. The walls were closing in on the priest. The evidence was overwhelming. But the truth? The truth was even darker than anyone had imagined. By 2006, the name Father Gerald Robinson no longer carried the same reverence it once did. He wasn't a priest anymore. He wasn't a trusted chaplain. He was something else now, an accused murderer. For 26 years, the case had remained buried, but the weight of truth had finally forced it back to the surface. And now, for the first time, Robinson stood where no priest ever wanted to be, before a jury. His trial began on April 24, 2006. And from the moment it started, one thing became clear. This was no ordinary courtroom battle. The prosecution came prepared. They laid out the evidence piece by piece, like a puzzle that had been waiting decades to be completed. The murder weapon. A letter opener, shaped like a miniature sword. It wasn't just a coincidence, The deep, distinct wounds on Sister Margaret N's chest were an exact match to the blade. The crime scene, staged in a way that pointed to ritualistic elements, an eerie arrangement of the body, blood markings that didn't seem random, a murder carried out on the eve of Holy Saturday. And then there was the timeline. Robinson had access to the chapel. He was there at the time of the killing. His alibi, inconsistent. His behavior, cold, detached, disturbingly indifferent. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had used his position in the church as a shield, hiding in plain sight while an innocent woman's murder went unanswered for over 2 decades. But the defense wasn't going down without a fight. Robinson's attorneys tried to poke holes in the evidence. They claimed the letter opener had no clear DNA tying it to the crime. They argued that after so many years, witness memories were unreliable. And then they played their strongest card, his age. By now, Robinson was 68 years old, frail, quiet, no longer the imposing figure he once was. His lawyers hoped that the jury would see a weak, elderly man and question whether he could have committed such a brutal crime. But the evidence was undeniable. And when the verdict came down, the world finally got its answer. On May 11, 2006, after just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered their decision. Guilty. Father Gerald Robinson was convicted of murder. The sentence? 15 years to life in prison. He barely reacted as the words were spoken. No outburst. No emotion. Just the quiet acceptance of a man whose past had finally caught up to him. But justice, as swift as it seemed, came too late for some. Sister Margaret N had been gone for decades. Many of her loved ones had passed away without ever knowing the truth. And for others, the trial only opened more doors than it closed. Because as Robinson sat in prison, serving his time, one question still lingered. Was this just a crime of anger? A moment of fury? Or was it something far more disturbing, something the church never wanted the world to see? Sister Margaret and Pahl spent her life in devotion. A woman of faith. A healer. A guide to those who sought comfort within the walls of the church. And yet, those same walls became the place of her brutal end. The chapel, meant to be a house of worship, became a crime scene. Her trust, her service, her very existence was erased in an act of unfathomable violence. And for 24 years, the truth remained locked away. Hidden. Buried beneath bureaucracy. Buried beneath power. Buried beneath the silence of an institution that should have sought justice, but instead, let dust settle over the case file. Father Gerald Robinson was convicted. Justice, at least in the eyes of the law, was served. He spent his final years behind bars, where he died in 2014. But even in death, questions remain. The crime was gruesome, calculated, precise. Too precise to be a momentary loss of control. The ritualistic elements, the wounds, the positioning, the eerie symbolism, pointed to something beyond simple rage. Something deliberate. And Robinson, he took his secrets to the grave. But here's where things get even more unsettling. During the trial, whispers began to surface. Survivors came forward. Stories of abuse, cover-ups, darkness hidden beneath the cloth of holiness. Some claimed the church had known about Robinson long before the murder. That his violent tendencies weren't a secret. That there were others, other victims, other atrocities. And yet, nothing was done. Sister Margaret N's case was closed in the eyes of the law, but the deeper story? It remains an open wound. A wound stitched together with secrecy, fear, and the unsettling possibility that what happened in that chapel was only part of a much larger nightmare. A nightmare the world may never fully wake up from. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to contribute to our first 1,000 subscribers. Was this a crime of rage? A single act of violence? Or was it part of something even darker, something that still lurks in the shadows of history? This true crime documentary was brought to you by Frederick of Crime and Tragedy Watch. Stay aware, stay safe, and stay tuned for the next chilling true crime case. Thank you.